had stopped noticing how quiet the house felt until David pointed it out without saying a word. My husband had left that morning with the usual half-hearted goodbye, his mind already buried in meetings and numbers, and the silence that followed him out the door settled over everything like dust. I tried filling it with work around the kitchen, focusing on the small project I'd been shaping for weeks, something simple yet precious to me. When the doorbell rang, I expected a delivery. Instead, David stood there holding a folder against his chest, apologizing for disturbing me. He never used to come himself. Normally my husband handled office files directly. But recently, David had been showing up more often, always with some reasonable excuse. I didn't question it that he stepped inside hesitantly, wiping his shoes on the mat like a guest trying not to impose. He had this gentle way of observing a room without making you feel observed. While he explained why the documents were urgent, his eyes flicked briefly to the project drying on the counter. "You made this?" he asked, genuinely curious, not pretending interest the way my husband sometimes did. I nodded and tried brushing it off, but the question lingered in the air between us. He asked what it was supposed to represent, and I joked lightly without thinking. "If you stay long enough, maybe I'll let you taste it." I meant the recipe I'd been experimenting with, something small, nothing meaningful, but the words felt heavier than they should have. He laughed, not flirtatiously, just surprised, like he wasn't used to me teasing. Then the moment drifted away, but it left a faint warmth behind it. When he left, the silence felt different. Not emptier, just more noticeable. Over the next days his visits became less formal. He'd drop by with office papers, or with a question my husband supposedly needed answered, though I suspected he volunteered for these tasks. He had this way of listening that made you feel you weren't talking into a void. I didn't say anything inappropriate. I didn't encourage anything. But I found myself talking about things I didn't mention to my husband anymore. Small frustrations, fleeting thoughts, memories triggered by the things we both noticed around the house. He never pushed, never pried, but he understood tone in a way my husband didn't. If I was tired, he felt it. If I was forcing a smile, he caught it instantly. It was an attraction, not at first. It was simply the feeling of being seen, and that alone was dangerous. One afternoon, he lingered longer than usual. I realized I'd started waiting for these moments without admitting it. When he asked about the recipe again, "Did you ever finish it?" I felt my pulse skip. There was nothing flirtatious in his tone, yet the question touched the same strange thread from before. I told him maybe I'd let him try it next time. He smiled, a small one, respectful, but undeniably pleased. After he left, I caught myself standing in the doorway a moment too long. I tried shaking it off, reminding myself that he was just my husband's coworker. But that night, when my husband barely acknowledged me over dinner, I realized how easy it had become to look forward to the only person who actually noticed the things I said. And that was when everything quietly began. David started arriving at the house with a kind of careful consistency that made it feel unplanned yet strangely dependable. My husband never noticed, or if he did, he assumed it was because of work. That was the easiest part about all of this. The excuses were built into their jobs. No one questioned a coworker bringing files, asking for signatures, or dropping off revised reports. But I began to notice how David chose times when he knew my husband wasn't around. Early afternoons, late mornings, moments where the house felt suspended in its own quiet. He would knock softly, almost apologetically, and always pause before stepping inside, as if giving me a chance to say no. I never did. Conversation with him had become effortless. He didn't talk over me or rush me. I told myself it was harmless, that people were allowed to enjoy being understood. But there were small shifts I couldn't ignore. He'd pay attention to things like whether I had slept, whether my voice carried exhaustion, whether my hands fidgeted while I spoke. He noticed the kinds of details only someone who truly listens catches. One afternoon, he found me frustrated with a broken drawer. My husband had promised for months to fix it but never got around to it. Without hesitation, David crouched down and quietly repaired it with a precision that felt almost symbolic. "You shouldn't have to wait on someone to do simple things for you," he said softly. The words weren't meant to criticize anyone. He simply said what he saw. Still, it lingered inside me in a way I didn't want to examine too closely. It didn't escape him that my smile was smaller than usual that day. "Is everything all right?" he asked, not formally but gently, in a tone someone uses when they genuinely want the truth. I brushed it off at first, pretending I was just tired, but he didn't believe that. He never pushed, yet his eyes always invited honesty when I deflected again. He hesitated before speaking. You know, you don't have to pretend with me. A harmless sentence on the surface, but the kind that slips past your defenses without asking permission. My chest tightened, not in attraction but in recognition. Someone noticed. Someone cared enough to ask twice. The taste it moment from before unexpectedly came up again. He said it in a half-joking way, maybe to lighten the heaviness he felt from me. You still never let me taste that thing you were working on, he said with a small smile. But the way he said it didn't feel like he was asking for the recipe. It felt like he was asking if I trusted him enough to share anything real. I didn't answer right away. Inside, something twisted, not desire, but the dangerous comfort of emotional closeness. He must have sensed the shift because he grew quieter than usual afterward. Before leaving, he paused at the door. I'm around if you ever need to talk. About anything. The emphasis wasn't dramatic, it was steady, sincere, and it cut through the silence more deeply than he probably intended. That night, while my husband scrolled through his phone and barely responded to me, I caught myself remembering David's words. I wondered why it felt easier to confide in someone who wasn't my partner. And though nothing inappropriate had happened, I acknowledged something I had been avoiding. David and I had stepped into a place where emotional boundaries were already bending, whether either of us said it aloud or not. The day everything shifted began quietly, almost forgettably. My husband had promised we would go out that evening, something simple, something we hadn't done in months. I held on to that promise all day, letting it carry me through the dullness of chores and the heaviness of unspoken thoughts. But an hour before we were supposed to leave, he sent a short message saying he couldn't make it. Too much work, too many deadlines, the same excuses he'd repeated so often that even he sounded bored with them. I stared at the message long enough for the screen to dim. I didn't reply. The house felt colder after that. I tried distracting myself, tried pretending it didn't matter. But the disappointment settled deep. I didn't expect David to show up that day. Yet the moment the doorbell rang, some instinct in me already knew it was him. He stood there with another envelope my husband needed to review, though he didn't even try to sell the excuse convincingly. He could see something was wrong the instant I opened the door. You okay? He asked, but the question wasn't casual. He wasn't asking out of habit. His voice lowered in that way it does when he's trying to give someone space to fall apart safely. I stepped aside and let him in without thinking. It wasn't planned, it wasn't deliberate. It was simply easier to let him enter than to stand there pretending I was fine. He noticed the untouched table settings immediately and didn't ask why. He had already put the pieces together. My husband's absence was loud in the room, loud enough that neither of us needed to mention it. For a while we talked about ordinary things, work, the project on the counter, the drawer he fixed last week, but none of it held real weight. The unsaid things hovered too close. Eventually he asked again gently, "What happened?" I hesitated, not because I didn't want to tell him but because I wasn't used to anyone actually listening. But the silence felt heavier than honesty does, so I told him. Not everything, but enough. The canceled plans, the growing distance, the feeling of being married to someone who treated me like an afterthought. David didn't interrupt, didn't offer empty comfort. He listened the way people listen when they care about the answer, not when they're waiting to respond. The longer he stood there, the more I realized how starved I had been for empathy. When I finished, he took a slow breath and said quietly, "You don't deserve that." His voice wasn't angry or judgmental, just painfully sincere. That sincerity was what made it dangerous. I don't know what made me say it, but the words slipped out before I had time to filter them. "Do you still want to taste it?" He froze for a moment, not because he misunderstood the meaning but because he understood it too well. I wasn't offering food. I was offering truth, raw, unfiltered, unguarded. I was offering the part of myself I had kept buried under years of pretending everything was fine. He stepped closer. Not in a way that breached boundaries, but in a way that acknowledged them. "Only if you want me to," he said softly. The air tightened between us, thick with the weight of things neither of us dared name. What followed wasn't touch. It wasn't anything physical. It was worse. It was the quiet moment where someone looks at you and sees everything you've been trying to hide. He saw the hurt, the loneliness, the longing for someone to simply show up and mean it. And I let him see it. That was the real crossing of the line. letting someone witness the parts of me my husband didn't even notice existed anymore. When he finally stepped back, I realized my hands were trembling. He noticed, of course. He always noticed. "You don't have to say anything now," he murmured. "Just don't lie to yourself about what you're feeling." He left moments later, but the room still felt full of him. And for the first time I couldn't tell if I felt guilt, relief, or something more dangerous than both. The house was quiet again after David left, but it wasn't the same quiet as before. It carried weight now, a subtle pressure pressing against the walls, the air, and even the things I touched. I moved through it slowly, noticing the small details in ways I hadn't before. The way the sunlight fell across the counter, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the scattered papers on the table. Everything felt sharper, more immediate. As if I were seeing it for the first time, I thought about the words I had shared, the truth I had allowed him to witness. My chest tightened when I realized that, in that moment, I had let someone else taste the loneliness and frustration that had been mine alone. Not in a physical sense, not in any way that could be seen or judged outwardly, but emotionally. It was an intimacy that was invisible to the world but tangible to me, and that made it dangerous. I could still feel the weight of his understanding, the gentleness in his eyes when he chose to listen rather than offer advice. He had given me something my husband hadn't, presence. And it hurt in a way that was impossible to ignore. My husband walked in later, still distracted by his phone, still wrapped up in obligations that felt less important than they were. I watched him from across the room, a strange mixture of longing and resentment rising inside me. I wanted to tell him everything, to make him understand the gap that had grown between us, the emptiness I felt when he was nearby but absent. But I didn't. The words lodged in my throat, unwilling to come out. He didn't notice my silence, of course. He never did. Later I found myself thinking of David again. Not in a way that was shameful, but in a way that made me aware of how easily someone could slip into the spaces that were left unguarded, the corners of the heart that were overlooked. He had offered me attention without expectation, understanding without judgment, and it had stirred something that was both comforting and alarming. The realization hit me. I had been craving this connection for so long that I hadn't noticed the danger of allowing it, of letting someone else see what I had hidden for years. By nightfall, I had made a choice. Not a dramatic one, not a sudden decision to change everything, but a quiet acknowledgement that things could not stay as they were. I would not act on impulse or let emotion dictate my actions. David had shown me what I was missing, and that knowledge alone was powerful. It forced me to confront the truth about my marriage and about myself. The neglect, the silence, the distance that had crept in without warning. I realized that protecting my own emotional well-being required honesty, either with my husband or with myself. The taste I had offered David was not forgotten, but it became a lesson rather than an event. It was a reminder that emotional intimacy could exist outside of marriage, and that noticing it didn't have to lead to betrayal. I would carry the awareness of it forward, letting it guide my actions and my choices. Perhaps it would lead to confrontation, perhaps to change, or perhaps simply to acceptance. The weight remained, but it was a weight I could bear because it was rooted in truth. In the end, the house returned to its usual rhythm, the quiet shifting once again to something more ordinary. Yet I knew that nothing would ever feel quite the same. I had glimpsed the depth of what had been missing, and that glimpse would linger, a quiet echo of understanding, a reminder that attention and empathy mattered. David had left, physically gone, but emotionally present, and I would carry the memory of that day with me as I moved forward, careful not to lose sight of what truly mattered.